Stay tuned for today's episode where we continue with our series on W.C. Handy's Northwest Alabama roots, talking about his paternal grandfather, Christopher Brewer. That's up next. We're here in historic St. Florian in the rain, as you can probably tell, on the location of the old Wilson Cemetery, to talk about W.C. Handy's paternal grandfather, Christopher Brewer, who is probably buried not too far from here. According to W.C. Handy, the only truly musically inclined person in his family had been his maternal grandfather, Christopher Kit Brewer, who was born in 1812 and died sometime after 1880, saying of Mr. Brewer, quote, that before he got religion, he used to play the fiddle for dances, being allowed by his master, John S. Wilson, to keep the profits. His grandpa Brewer told Handy that, quote, in his day, folks knew as well as we do when it was time for the music to get hot. They had their own way of bearing down. A boy would stand behind the fiddler with a pair of knitting needles in his hands. From this position, the youngster would reach around the fiddler's left shoulder and beat on the strings in the manner of a snare drummer, unquote. Christopher Kit Brewer was born around 1812, according to his 1880 census enumeration, in Virginia. Kit Brewer was a former slave of Ann Brewer, the wife of John S. Wilson, who was born in 1789 and died in 1865, whose plantation was located on part of the land on which we're now standing. In 1871, the old John S. and Matthew Wilson plantations became the German Catholic colony of St. Florian. After the Civil War and freedom from slavery, Christopher Brewer opted to remain on the Wilson plantation, probably as a sharecropper. The Wilson plantation itself was situated, as we said, in what 1871 became the German town of St. Florian. We don't know the name of Christopher Brewer's first wife or her birth and death dates. However, Christopher's first wife gave him at least 3 children, 2 sons, Buchanan and Moses, and a daughter, Elizabeth, W.C. Handy's mother. Sometime after April 30th, 1865, Christopher Brewer's first wife died, and on December 27th, 1868, Christopher Brewer married the young Emily Jones, some 14 years his junior, with his future in-law, Reverend William W. Handy, performing the ceremony. That's interesting. At some point, Christopher Brewer himself got religion and became a Christian, probably a Methodist, as his son Moses later became a Methodist minister. The night of April 30th, 1865, Christopher Brewer was involved in some hair-raising escapades not of his choosing. He was one of the sharecroppers that had remained on the Wilson plantation, and on that particular night, Mountain Tom Clark and his gang members raided the Wilson plantation, allegedly looking for a large sum of money that Mr. Wilson had buried somewhere on the plantation. They tortured and killed Mr. Wilson. He would not talk about where the money was hidden. According to one account, they tore pages out of his Bible, set him on fire, and burned him to death. He would not talk. They shot his nephew and grandson. Neither one would talk. The grandson survived. As you probably read on the historical marker, the night of April 30th, 1865, Mountain Tom Clark and his gang of Civil War guerrilla bushwhackers and outlaw deserters raided the Wilson plantation. They were allegedly looking for a large sum of money that old man Wilson had hidden on the plantation, and Christopher Kit Brewer, W.C. Handy's paternal grandfather, was involved in this raid. The outlaws showed up probably wearing Union uniforms, and most of Tom Clark's core gang members were from Company B of the 2nd Tennessee Mounted Infantry, United States. They tortured and killed old Mr. Wilson by, according to one newspaper account, setting pages from a Bible on fire and burning him to death with that. he wouldn't tell them where the money was buried. So they shot his nephew and grandson. The grandson survived. The nephew died from his wounds. They also shot W.C. Handy's grandfather, Christopher Brewer, and hit his grandma Brewer over the head with the butt of a gun. They refused to talk and tell where the money was buried either. Well, according to historical information, Christopher Brewer later informed the grandson, Turner Saunders Cooney Foster, where that money was buried. He went up to Nashville around 1868 or 1869 to tell Mr. Saunders Foster where that money was buried. And so Cooney Foster came back and was able to retrieve the money that his grandfather had buried on the plantation. Sources disagree as to actually how much money it was. Oh, and I forgot to mention, they also shot the plantation overseer, George Twitty. He came up to investigate the noise, and they shot him and allegedly had to come back the next day to finish him off, unfortunately. But Christopher Brewer was shot and survived his wounds without telling where the money was buried to the outlaws. But he later did tell the grandson who survived where that money was buried. And sources, they disagree as to actually how much money he got back, that was retrieved. But it was a pretty hefty sum of money. But Christopher Brewer, W.C. Handy's paternal grandfather, who refused to tell where his former master's money was buried and was shot but survived. Now we're standing here in front of the Wilson Wild Family Cemetery. Usually on plantations such as the Wilson Plantation, there was a white Wild Family Cemetery, and usually about 500 feet away there would be a slave cemetery. So we believe that Christopher Brewer was probably buried in the old Wilson family servant slave cemetery, although it's possible he may be buried at the Hopewell AME Church, which is not too far from here, where W.C. Handy's mother, Elizabeth, is probably buried with some other Handy family members. Basically, we're not really sure where Christopher Brewer and his two wives are buried. Could be here, somewhere on the old Wilson Plantation in a servant cemetery, or possibly Hopewell AME Church. We're just really not sure. Thanks for watching this episode of the W.C. Handy's Northwest Alabama Roots. Hopefully you've learned a little bit of interesting information about not only his Grandpa Handy in the first installment, but about his Grandpa Brewer in this installment. Stay tuned, we've got a couple of other installments in this series on W.C. Handy's Northwest Alabama origins to bring you. And of course, don't forget about the W.C. Handy Festival, which begins July 23rd and runs through August 1st. So you'll not want to miss that. And again, stay tuned for two more in this series.